first view of a guest.
Okay, it's 6 o'clock. Let's get this started in a second. Had to turn off my dryer so that wasn't a constant noise behind everything. Okay, so this is week 7. Next week is week 8. So you are going to be having your midterm exam next week. I am in the process of writing it because this is a new course prep for me, which I've probably said before. What else? But you'll get that study guide and stuff on Monday, just like you get all the other stuff. And then we're going to have our study session for this class during our normally scheduled class time. So if you are watching this recording, there will also be a recording of the study session. So you have that at your disposal. Yeah, so before I get started in on lecture, are there any questions about really anything with the course? No? I see a lot of people have their cameras on, and that is totally fine because it does help bandwidth. Those of you who have your cameras on, please keep them on because I need that to tell if things have frozen out. We already had a close call about 5 minutes ago, but I think the feed is okay. There's no quiz this week. So that's why I made an announcement about that this morning, because that is the kind of thing that can trigger like 30 or so people sending me a email about. I am currently behind on my emails. Again, by tomorrow, I want to be caught up on that. Yeah. So with no pressing questions, I'll get started in on tonight's lecture. So just let me screen share. Do a couple other low grade things. Okay. So this week's lecture, you guys see, you see it? Very good, thank you. This is lecture 6.1, Stratification. This week, I laid out the agenda slide a little bit differently because of concerns one of my students had at a different school entirely, but I think they are very valid concerns. So this week we're going to talk about social stratification, systems of stratification involved in that, race and ethnicity. We'll be addressing social class, concepts related to social class, and intersectionality. There is no culture of the week this week because basically the way this lecture is structured is taking two very big ideas and kind of jamming them together. I'm suspecting it's because we are using an anthropology textbook, right? And anthropologists and sociologists tend to think about things a little differently sometimes. From what I've seen in the material and what I'm perceiving is that anthropologists tend to think of social stratification as all one big thing, but sociologists like me tend to see race and ethnicity and then issues related to class as being two really different phenomena. So that's why I am doing that. Basically, the very short of it is that we're jamming two lectures together. So I'm not doing a culture of the week because it might be as long as it is. So, but with my students' concern in a different class, there are definitely people in our student population in the world that are, can be, put into troubled psychological places, and by talking about subjects. And if they have a little bit of a warning about that, that can definitely help those people. And if you are one of those people, please just be aware that we're going to be talking about the following things. With that said, you still are accountable for the content, so you still have to work it over eventually. And if always anything gets in the way of that, please let me know. But this lecture is going to be talking about racism, the Holocaust, genocide, poverty, slavery, general inequality, and discrimination, because sociology and anthropology are just super sunny topics. I say this all the time, sociology is a bummer, but these are the things we're talking about this week. So let's get into the content of it. So first we talk about social stratification in a very general sense. Social stratification is a social hierarchy resulting from relatively permanent, unequal distributions of goods, services, and life chances. So it's the hierarchy that exists to society. And then what's one of it? Whatever. Okay, anyway, it's the hierarchy to society. Anyway. And the hierarchy dictates your life chances. Your life chances are the opportunities that people have to fulfill their potential in society. You don't have to take advantage of life chances. You just have access to them, right? You have the choice to take that and to do that thing, right? And that is an element of privilege, is having that choice to do the thing. So being able to attend college, it might make sense for you to attend college. It might not make sense for you to attend college, but being able to make that choice is definitely part of life chances. Being able to attend graduate school, being able to inherit a business. These are all examples of things that can lead to, that can be life chances. And that is, all of those are tied to your position in the stratification hierarchy present in our society. And there are a lot of adjacent topics to this slide because it's the very beginning of the lecture. There probably, if you're an engaged student, a bunch of other things are trickling out and percolating in your brain, and I promise we'll get to most of those. So every society has some form of stratification. Variations in stratification can include these three elements. Criteria. So what determines stratification? Is it race? Is it class? Is it gender? Is it a bunch of other stuff? We humans are very, very good at ranking and stratifying things. So as a result of that, just amazing, there are a lot of very creative ways to stratify us other humans. It's like saying we're very creative in the ways that we do warfare and murder as well. It's not necessarily a good thing, but we're pretty good at it. Systems of stratification. So we have class systems, we have caste systems, we have things like feudalism and slavery. These are all different systems of stratification, and I'll talk about especially class and caste in this lecture. And we talked about feudalism and slavery a bit when we talked about economics, and then severity of stratification. How stratified is our society compared to other societies? There are certainly societies that have had less stratification than ours. There are certainly societies who have had much more stratification than ours. And that's something to take in mind when studying the stratification of a given society. I didn't mention this when I was just getting started. I did get these lecture notes fully onto Blackboard before we got started today, so that should be available in your slides and recording section right now. There was a little bit of problem with that last week, but it's taken care of. So Here's an alternate definition of social stratification. Both definitions are accurate. This one just talks about something a little bit differently. Social stratification is the classification of statuses into a hierarchy. So there are different types of statuses. Put a different way, this is also a definition of status. A status is your position in the social stratification hierarchy. There are different types of status, and I think I messed this one up slightly. Yes, I did. So I have to give you the definition of those two terms. We have achieved statuses and we have ascribed statuses. An achieved status is something you did something to get, right? So you are students, you are attending college. In order to do that, you had to score a certain score on either the ACT or SAT. You had to get certain grades. You had to apply to come to Otterbein. You had to do all of these things and jump through those hoops. In doing that, you achieve the status of student. Hopefully, you will achieve the status of college graduate and then other statuses down the road. A achieved status is something you did to get the status. Now, with that said, an achieved status doesn't have to be a good status. Achieved status could be convict or murderer or what else? So whoever the bad guys are in society, a negative status like that is also an achieved status. And then we have ascribed statuses. Ascribed statuses are statuses that you did nothing to do, it's just part of who you are. Slavery, and this is specifically talking about types of social stratification. If you're born into a slavery system, if you're born a slave, or if you're born into a family of people who own slaves, that dictates where you are in the social hierarchy, right? Same goes with serfdom and caste. We'll talk much more about caste later on in this lecture. Other examples of ascribed statuses in our society, your sex is an ascribed status. You didn't do anything to do that. Your race is an ascribed status. Who your parents are is an ascribed status. The year you were born is an ascribed status. There are a whole bunch of things that we didn't actually choose to be part of ourselves that make us ascribed statuses. Does that distinction make sense? Yeah, okay, very good. Now, social inequality is the unequal distribution of wealth, power, or prestige between social statuses. There's not much text on the slide, but it's a big, important concept. But it's something we know by living in the world. Some people have more access to resources. Some people have more access to power. Other people have less access to resources and less access to power. All societies have a degree of social inequality, but different societies have different degrees of social inequality. This very much talks about that third element of stratification of severity. I could easily swap in social inequality and be effectively the same thing. Social mobility. Is my speed okay for you guys? Should I slow down a little bit? You okay? Okay, we're doing good. Yeah. Social mobility is movement from one social strata to another. So from one spot in the social inequality, the social hierarchy to another. Social mobility is possible only in achieved status systems. So we live in a class society. We'll talk more about class later on. So social mobility is possible in our class society. There are different types of social mobility. Each of these gets its own slide. We have vertical social mobility, horizontal social mobility, and structural mobility. What the heck is happening? Some slides aren't where they belong, but I'll come back to those in a bit, I promise. Anyway, Some statuses are more accepted than other statuses. There's less emotional baggage tied in with that given status. You don't probably have hardly any emotional baggage, feeling bad about or whatever, maybe the year you were born or whatever, but there are other things that are much heavier on us, right? Class is definitely something that is weird in American society that we don't really like talking about so much. We have these, and I talk about this later on, these folk ways of not talking about how much money we make. Well, that's talking about your social class, right? It's considered rude to talk about money. Similarly, race. Race is also a social status that we're not super comfortable about talking about in our society. Both of these types of discrimination can be absolutely horrible, right? But there are different emotions tied in with these types of social statuses. And you could easily, you could write a book on the difference of our willingness to talk about class versus our willingness to talk about race. We have different issues with talking about both of them. Many Americans aren't even aware that class exists, that we do live in a class-based society. Some Americans claim, I mean, you can't deny race exists. There was the saying in the 90s, oh, I don't see race. Well, bullshit, right? Everyone sees race. It's what people look like, right? But class is a lot easier to lie to yourself that it doesn't exist. So let's talk about these systems. Not going to talk about slavery a whole lot because I really dug into it in lecture 4.1. However, slavery is the most extreme form of social stratification because it's based on the legal ownership of people and treatment of people as property. And I went into in great detail in the economics lecture about that. Here is another terrifying artifact from the slavery era in American history. This is a slave mask. This would be put on slaves as they were being forced to walk from one place to another. The most wicked part of the slave mask is this little bit right here that would go into the captive's mouth and would keep them from, it was said to pacify them, which is a brutal way of saying choke them for a couple days and make sure that they couldn't really breathe properly and start foaming at the mouth in a way basically that would make it hard to fight. Really wickedly vile stuff. And that's those kind of artifacts are what you get in a society where some people think that other people are either less than human or actually objects. But that is a system of stratification, right? A caste system. A caste system is a form of social stratification in which status is determined by one's family history and background, and this cannot be changed. The most documented and modern caste system in the world is the Indian caste system. It still does exist a little bit to this day. The Indian caste system was made illegal in the 1940s as part of Gandhi's revolution because, and what made it so horrible is the position of I think is Dalit class, the untouchable class. These people, the only jobs they were allowed to do in that society were the jobs that were considered to be the very worst, the most profane, the grossest. So in Indian society, many people are vegetarians. So people who worked at slaughterhouses were Dalits, untouchables, people who do sewer work, people who do basically a lot of jobs that are considered unclean. But so if your parents were untouchable, then you would be untouchable as well. If your parents were warriors or kings or priests, you would be up here. right? This is an ascribed status. You do nothing to actually get this position. And kind of an insidious element of the caste system is that it does take advantage of the religion of India. It is pretty well embedded into the many Hindu beliefs, especially regarding reincarnation. That kind of props up the caste system. And thus the rationale of the caste system is that if you are born untouchable, then you must have done something in a past life to deserve that negative reincarnation. If you're born Brahmin, then you did something good to deserve that reincarnation. This system of stratification was made much, much more severe once the British colonized India. They absolutely took advantage of the system. There's good anthropological evidence to show that they made it more racist. They added an additional layer of race into it. If in India, people who are Brahmin tend to, or a higher class status, tend to have much lighter skin. People who are Dalit or untouchable tend to have much darker skin. So that absolutely benefited the British colonists, right? Because their skin tended to be much lighter than the other people. So they just said, oh yeah, well, we're Brahmin or we're warriors. So therefore, you know, we are treated automatically better. And that is really a really wicked example of that. We'll talk more about colonialism toward the end of the course. We actually have specific time set around for that. One issue with this illustration is that it is not proportionate. There are not way more untouchables than there are other classes. There are fewer Brahmin, but it isn't like kind of pyramidal hierarchy quite like this. That's just kind of part of the visual aid. Okay, apartheid, again, we talked about apartheid in great detail last week. Apartheid was the system of segregation of racial and ethnic groups that was illegal in South Africa between 1948 and 1991. If you're watching the recordings and you don't know anything about apartheid, I suggest going back to lecture 5.1, where we laid that out in great detail. The apartheid government also, though, integrated both class and race together. So there was a race stratification system put into place and a class stratification system put into place. So people that lived in South Africa during that time had to deal with both of that stuff. We do have certainly racial stratification in our own society, but it is not the official accepted way to stratify people, right? Racism is not good, right? It's really bad. But so like there is an element of that we don't have to deal with in our society because it's not officially built into the system. So it's significantly different. Let's talk, see, one second, guys. I threw myself off with something. Okay, that's what happened. I threw myself off slightly. The way I normally talk about this stuff is my lead up to talking about class. And the way I put these slides together, we're just going to talk about race for now. So if you have questions about class and the class system, we are going to talk about that later in the lecture. I'm just getting used to the new slides. So race and ethnicity, let's talk about that stuff. And then I imagine after we do race and ethnicity, we're going to maybe take a 5-minute break or so, because this might take me about half an hour, maybe, I don't know. So race. Race is a socially defined category based on real or perceived biological differences between groups of people. So yes, what you look like, your physical characteristics are based on genetics. Absolutely sure. That's based on biology, sure. But how our society categorizes and classifies you, that is a social construction. Examples of race include Latino, African American, slash Black, white slash Caucasian. There are many different racial categories our society uses, but these are 3 examples of race. Now, you can have a very interesting and meaningful conversation about whether Latino or Latinx is a racial category or an ethnic category, and you can get really intellectual about that. If this was a course on race and ethnicity, we absolutely would have that conversation, but for the sake of this lecture, we're going to call it a race, but if you see it classified as ethnicity elsewhere, you can also make that argument. I'm not saying you can't. Ethnicity, then, is a socially defined category based on common language, religion, nationality, history, or other cultural factors, right? So ethnicity is based on knowledges, right? It's based on who you grew up with, where you grew up, those sorts of things. They're based on cultural factors. So some examples of ethnicity are Pennsylvania Dutch. My family's Pennsylvania Dutch. I already talked about that. So my ethnicity is Pennsylvania Dutch. My race is white. Somali. Somali people are Black, African. They racially, but they are ethnically Somali. If a white person grew up in Somalia and then they moved here from Somalia, they would be racially white but ethnically Somali. Irish people tend to be ethnically white. Racially white, ethnically Irish. Mexican people tend to be racially Latino and ethnically Mexican. Does that all make sense? Any questions on that? It's a difference it's the cultural differences. That's what makes that stuff up. So now, who cares? What's the difference? Well, it's a big difference. It's a difference in how we deal with these social phenomena as human beings and how it plays out. Sociologists see race and ethnicities as social constructs because race isn't based on biology, right? It is based on your physical characteristics. It is not based on biology. This is a really super interesting concept once you take into account the Human Genome Project as it was completed, the phase of that was completed in the early 2000s. Prior to the end of the Human Genome Project, there were hypotheses going around that we would be able to identify clusters of genes that would be able to tell us the person's race based on their genetic makeup. How could that be useful? Well, it could be useful, say, in forensics when maybe we find a body and decomposition has gone on for quite some time. We could maybe determine their race and try to get some criminal justice stuff done that way. The reality of the matter is that we didn't find those clusters of markers the way we thought we would. We can look at your DNA and say, we see here they have, this person produces greater degrees of melatonin. We see here all these things about people's physical appearances, but they aren't clustered and in that way, really. Racial categories change over time. That's a big point. Racial categories are part of culture. Who Americans who are classified as white are today in 2020, if you would take many white Americans, take them back in time to the early 1800s, a lot of white Americans would not be considered white by the standards of the early 1800s. If you're of Italian descent, you wouldn't be considered white. Some Irish people, which is wild because we think of Irish people as being the whitest people, some Irish people wouldn't have been considered white under those conditions. Concepts of racial categories aren't necessarily always present. Unless you know a fair amount about Australia, you might not know what I mean when I talk about Aborigine people. Aborigine people have their own racial classification in Australia because there are a fair number of Aborigines. If I showed you a picture of an Aborigine person you know nothing about Australia, you'd probably think they were black, but they're not black. They're racially different. And these racial categories never have firm boundaries, right? There are social dynamics and conversation about who is white, who isn't white, who is black, who isn't black, who's Latino, who's Asian, what does Asian mean? Are people from Iran Asian? They're on the continent of Asia, right? But they are racially something else, right? Most typically that's classified as Middle Eastern or Arabic, right? Whatever that is, there are big question marks in this stuff. We think of race as being super, super concrete. The reality of the matter is it is sort of flexible. Now, that doesn't mean that this stuff doesn't have major consequences, right? They do have tremendously major consequences on your life chances and what can happen to you and what can't happen to you in our society. And I'm not saying that those are good things, but they are part of the social reality of our society. Yeah. Moving on to the next thing. So that distinction between, and this is a point I was getting to a moment ago, I don't think I really fleshed out. The distinction between race and ethnicity is super important because ethnicity can be displayed or hidden depending on your preferences or your social situation, right? You don't have to tell people all about your ethnicity. It's not part of who you are visibly. And if it really is part of who you are visibly, if it's part of how you dress or how you speak or whatever, you as a person, if you were in a dangerous situation, could take measures to try to change that, right? So that's a big difference. Racial identities, however, are always on display. And because they are part of your human body, your racial identity, then that means really different things in terms of the dynamics of those social identities. Here, this slide and the next slide are talking about different ways we use ethnicity. Symbolic ethnicity is an ethnic identity that is only relevant on specific occasions and does not significantly impact everyday life, right? So this is one way you can use ethnicity, is via symbolic ethnicity. It might be an important part of who you consider yourself as a person, right? But it's not necessarily part of your everyday life. So a key example of this is how Americans do St. Patrick's Day, right? On 364 days a year, there are tons of white people that don't even think about their Irish heritage, and then they basically think they have a license to drink too much green beer on St. Patrick's Day, right? That is a illustration of symbolic ethnicity. For example, I've talked about before how I'm a big genealogy nerd. I found that I am actually like 1/32 Irish, right? A minuscule amount of Irish. When I found that out, I sent my brother a text like, well, I guess we can really go wild on St. Patrick's Day this year, right? Because it has nothing to do really with my life. That's symbolic ethnicity. Situational ethnicity is an ethnic identity that can be either displayed or concealed depending on its usefulness in a given situation. This is using your ethnicity as beneficial, right? You are using the ethnicity in the situation to help yourself out in a given situation. You may, for example, be able to help out at a job a little bit better if you don't appear, well, your appearance wouldn't have anything to do with it, but let's say most people don't perceive you as being a Latino, and but you speak fluent Spanish because you're 1/4 Mexican, and your grandmother watched you as a little kid, so you are fully fluent in Spanish. If you are able then to not only speak Spanish, but speak Spanish like your grandmother from Mexico did, right? That would help in a situation if you are doing business with someone from Mexico, right? And that would definitely add a lot of what sociologists call cultural capital to the situation, right? It would help you connect with that person in a way that maybe you hadn't before. Now, our society is becoming increasingly diverse. Non-whites make up 38% total of the US population. Non-whites are projected to be the numeric majority by 2040. Now, what does that mean? That means that the largest racial group in the United States will still be white people. But I was saying me as a white person, white people will no longer be over 50% of the population. And that will be the first time in American history, well, American history after European people got here, the first time that that's happened is since 1776. The majority of babies under 2 years old were non-white in the year 2010, right? So that signifies that definitely the majority of people in probably maybe by 2060 will be non-white. Migration is the primary engine of population growth in the United States. This is because we have about an even birth rate even with the death rate, right? Actually, it's a little bit under the death rate, which is really common in most of the developed world. So the main reason why our population goes up is because of immigration. And by 2050, 1/5 of the US population will be immigrants. Now that is just projected growth of the US population. We really can't take into account their, well, certainly politics. We also can't take into account their migrations that may occur due to climate change. That may, who knows? But by current projections in growth, even if everything in our world stays exactly how it is right now, minus COVID, it'll be 1/5 of the population. This is an interesting bit of information. So we don't really have the highest amount of interactivity here, so I'll just talk through all my points. Normally, if I were teaching this course in person, I would ask you whatever, so I'll just talk through it. Take in this information for a second. Some of these numbers are slightly screwy on this chart, by the way. We'll just work around that. So you see here, 65% of the population is white. These are based off of 2010 census numbers. We may, depending how the Census Bureau is actually able to conduct the 2020 census, we'll see how badly screwed up that information is. But currently, our best guess is 65% of the population is white. About 16% of it is Latino. 12% of it is Black. Maybe 4 to 5% is Asian. 1.8 is 2 or more races, and we have other smaller numbers toward the bottom. My screen isn't super sharp, so I can't really see some of those numbers, but they're much smaller numbers. Now, when I teach this course in more urban areas where there are higher populations of African Americans, they say things like, there aren't nearly that many white people. There's way too many white people on there. But when I teach someplace like Dublin, the suburb of Columbus, they say, well, that's more Latinos or more African Americans than I would expect. And the reason for that is that these numbers, and with my New Mexico students, they would say there aren't nearly enough Latinos on the board, right? Because New Mexico, there are a lot of white people, but there are a whole lot more Latinos than there are here in Central Ohio, right? And there isn't a really super big African American population in New Mexico either. There are African Americans, but not as many. Basically, all of these numbers are all lumped together, is the short of what I'm saying. Minority groups do tend to cluster in cities. That is a global phenomena. That is absolutely something that exists. White people in the United States tend to be most of the population in the countryside. That is slightly different in the Southwest, where a lot of people in the countryside are Latino. A portion of that reason for that is, remember, before the Spanish-American War, a lot of the Southwest belonged to Mexico, right? And a lot of those Latino populations in the United States, they just never moved, right? So there are a lot of people that people would call Mexican that honestly, they've been there the whole time. It's super duper interesting, actually. There are super small villages in places like New Mexico and Arizona, way high up in the mountains, that have always fluently spoken Spanish, and they've never spoken English. That's really pretty neat stuff. And the reason is they were there way before we were the United States. It's interesting stuff. But the number of people identifying as mixed race is increasing. This is pretty interesting. So in 2000, 2.4%, actually I should take that back a scale. In the 1990 census, 0% of the population reported being mixed race. In 2000, 2.4% of the population, being 6.8 million people, identified as being mixed race. And then in 2010, 2.9, which doesn't look like a big percentage, but that's 9 million people. Now, I will tell you that there is no way this small of a group of people went from being 7 million to 9 million in only 10 years. That doesn't really match up with reproduction rates. The reason for that is that in the 2000 census, that was the first year that they asked a real meaningful mixed race question. And we've actually, the census has gotten much, much better with doing race over the last 30 years or so. More children are being born into interracial partnerships, though. So there absolutely is a bit of what you could call natural growth. But the bigger reason why the mixed race group is growing is simply because more people are starting to identify as being mixed race, right? It's becoming a part of our fabric of American society. Another reason there is that we no longer abide by, at least most parts of society don't abide by what's called the one-drop rule. The one-drop rule was it started off as an intensely racist concept where you could be denied use of public facilities or services because if you were any bit Black, even if you had, the notion was one drop of black blood, then you were all black, right? It's an intensely discriminatory concept, really wicked thing. Eventually, that got kind of almost taken back a little bit by the African American community, especially by Black Power groups who said, well, we have our own one drop rule, and if you're even a little bit black, you can be part of our group, in kind of a prideful way that was done. But really, that's not how we think of American society anymore. More and more, we're starting to think of people as being mixed race, and that is continuing to change. So that's another reason why mixed race is definitely a category that's building in our society. One second. Let's talk about some more complex definitions regarding race. So one of the major problems in conversations about race, in addition to other identities, is that the surrounding definitions are very complex, right? They're very, very complex thing. And I really see part of my mission as an instructor, whether I do it or not, I think it's important, is to help people understand nuance, right? Help them understand the little bitty details that really make things make sense. And as a result of definitions of race, people often misunderstand what other people who are also having conversations about race are trying to say, right? We really saw that in the Black Lives Matter, we still see it, in the Black Lives Matter movement, and then the counter movement or adjacent movements. When Black Lives Matter really became a real thing a couple years ago, and then a couple months after Black Lives Matter sunk in, people start saying, well, all lives matter. And there was about a 2-week period when all lives matter meant that all people actually do matter. It was like, it was very much a throwback to the 1990s in terms of, well, you know, I don't see race, everyone's equal, we're all humans, whatever, 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 really. And those statements, they do have a pretty not great effect of kind of taking the attention away from what the big concern about police brutality means. And then to come along with that, though, eventually people who said all lives matter in an inclusive way, some of those people went back and they saw the point that was made by Black Lives Matter. It's like, okay, we're not going to say that thing anymore. But then some other people started taking on all lives matter as a counterpoint to Black Lives Matter, because us Americans, we're very good at putting people into two categories, right? We're doing a whole lot of that around the election right now. And then eventually this Blue Lives Matter thing started to develop, where people saying, well, and it's bifurcation. It's putting people into two camps. Where, well, really the lives that are matter are the cop lives, right? And these kind of really wicked misunderstandings of I'm not racist, whatever, it really defeats a lot of points, right? I mean, we live in a world where, I hope this isn't a controversial statement, where we can definitely make policing better, right, and respect Black people's lives, while saying, yes, if you're a good cop, keep being a good cop, right? We can make policing work for society. But we just have these tendencies in our society to put things into one of two categories in a way that is, if we could fix that, we would really have something on our hands. It's one of our major dilemmas as a society right now. Anyway, though, a minority group. Let's talk about what exactly a minority group is when we talk about the social sciences. A minority group is a social group that is systematically denied access to power and resources available to the dominant groups in a society. A minority group is not inherently fewer in numbers than the dominant group, right? That's not what we're talking about in sociology. We're talking about power, right? And access to power. So, for example, we talked last week about South Africa. Blacks in South Africa, even though they were 75% of the population, still in terms of power were a racial minority group because they were not able to get into positions of power in their society. Let's talk about different types of discrimination. Well, I'm going to come back to this slide in a second. I need this slide right now. So, prejudice and discrimination are different things. Prejudice is a thought process. It is an idea about the characteristics of a group, right? It's ideas you have about certain groups of people, whether that's based on sex, whether that's based on sexuality, whether that's based on race. These are ideas you have about groups of people. It is when people are prejudiced, they tend to apply those ideas to all members of the group. And when people are prejudiced, they're unlikely to change their attitudes when they are presented with evidence against it, right? So, for example, if someone thinks that everyone from Mexico is lazy, but then they work with somebody in an office who is Mexican, and they see that this guy, Jim, he's not lazy, right? Well, the prejudiced person might think or might even say, well, yeah, that Jim over there, he's one of the good ones, right? That kind of thinking, that doesn't change. Discrimination then is an action, right? Discrimination is unequal treatment of individuals because of their social group, and discrimination is usually, but not always, based on prejudice. It is possible to be accidentally discriminatory. That's entirely possible. But usually, though, discrimination is based on some kind of prejudice, even if that prejudice is subconscious, which is absolutely a thing. So let's go back to this definition then for a second. There are different kinds of discrimination. Individual discrimination is discrimination that is carried out by one person against another person. So this is me discriminating against you. An example being a landlord doesn't rent to you because you're black, but they don't give this as the reason. They don't have to give it as the reason, right? It doesn't make it discrimination, not discrimination, just because you say, I don't rent to black people, right? However, that type of specific discrimination is illegal. It's luckily illegal for a lot of things. It's not necessarily, anyway, that's getting off onto another thing. Instances of individual discrimination are often caused by what's called implicit bias. Implicit bias, and if you want to know more about implicit bias, I'd say maybe take a sociology class, take a psych class. Implicit bias is a type of unconscious bias present in most people's brains, right? And this is really implicit bias, one of the major findings of sociology in the last 25 years. We have found that we are taught to be racist by society, or to be sexist, and to be homophobic, and all of these things, and to be classist. We'll talk about classism later today. We are wired by society to be these ways. Even if we are ideological, let me look at my next slide. Okay, good. I was wondering if I was getting ahead of myself. Even if we are ideologically opposed to being racist, right? So it's entirely possible. You can think racism is horrible, racism is bad, I think racism is horrible all of the time. That can be what you believe, but unfortunately, it is still possible, if you have those beliefs, to be implicitly biased against, say, African Americans or Latinos or whoever, right? That's possible. Now, and that sounds like a terrible thing, and it is a not good thing, but the really super cool thing about implicit bias is you can take tests to test your implicit bias. So one of the more notable ones is the Harvard implicit bias test. And you can go and take the implicit bias test, and you can take about 5 of them before your readings start getting incorrect. But if you think maybe, hey, maybe I have bad feelings about Black people I'm not aware of, right? I'm implicitly biased against Black people. You can take the test and find out that, and you might get your test, if you think that, you might get your test back saying, yes, you are moderately prejudiced, implicitly biased against Black people. Well, how do you fix that? This is really cool. This is really neat stuff. Research has found that when people have implicit bias against a group, if you consume media or if you consume cultural events of that group that you find you have a bias against, that bias can go away over time. That's super neat. That's super, super cool. So if you found you were implicitly biased against LGBT people, gay people, whatever part of that group, right? And then you go and, you go to a pride parade, or you watch some logo, or you watch a bunch of gay movies, right? That implicit bias, if you took the test later, chances are it would be found to have gone down, which is really, really cool science. And it sounds too good to be true. It's really amazing stuff. In other classes, I do encourage students to take implicit bias tests. I don't have that assigned for this class, I don't think. It's a worthwhile exercise, as long as you understand that it's not the tests, it's a neat thing. Okay, moving on. So now, institutional discrimination. We just talked about individual discrimination. Let's talk about institutional discrimination. This is a systematic discrimination carried out by social institutions. So it could be political, economic, educational, it could be another system that affects all members of a group who come in contact with that institution, right? An example of this would be a condo association having rules against renting to African Americans. Now that kind of thing, that is absolutely illegal today. It's illegal to enforce, but actually, if you would say today in 2020, buy a house from somebody who was in their late 90s, or you buy it right after they died, it is entirely possible that you could look at the deed of that house, and these still exist places. And deep in the wording of that deed, it could say the purchaser of this house pledges to not sell to any person of color, any non-white person. That absolutely existed in the past. And because this person was very old, hopefully they didn't believe that thing. It was just buried deep in the actual wording. And that is an example of institutional discrimination, right? When the whole structure of the social structure is itself either intentionally or unintentionally racist. Now, what you have to understand about institutional discrimination, that this is a type of racism that can occur, that can be fully accidental, right? A real super clear example of this, of institutional discrimination, doesn't have to do with race, but has to do with ableism. There are organizations that are up a flight of stairs, right? And so the only way to get to this office or this store is to go up the stairs, and maybe the shop owner can't afford to put a ramp in. Well, and clearly they aren't trying to discriminate against people who can't go upstairs, right, in an ableist kind of way, but that still is then, though, institutional discrimination because of the literal structure of the building. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah, so institutional, and when companies, when corporations, whatever, get in trouble with institutional discrimination, a lot of times it is accidental. And then how you can determine the character of that organization is how quickly and how willing they are to actually change and fix that, right? Yeah. So. Now, there are multiple ways that we can define racism itself, right? And for this reason, different people trying to fix problems with race are often trying to address different problems. We have language problems in our society about different types of racism. So you can, I've had this myself talking to my father-in-law, and Aladdin. Aladdin is an example of a movie that definitely has race issues. And there are parts of the original cut of Aladdin, particularly the original opening song of the Aladdin movie, is markedly racist against people of Middle Eastern descent. It's wild. But you say that to someone, it's like, yeah, that movie has it's a racist movie, right? Well, there are people in our society, though, that I'm talking about racism from a structural standpoint, and other people's understanding of racism is that, well, basically, you're not directly discriminating against sometimes explicitly a Black person, and that's the only kind of racism there actually is, right? And people have different concepts of racism itself, is what I'm getting at. We'll talk about those different concepts here in the following slides. So as a basic definition, this is the most common definition of racism in our society. It is a set of beliefs about the superiority of one racial or ethnic group over other groups, right? And this ideology or thought set of racism is often used to justify inequality. So these justifications are either vocalized or kept to oneself, that, well, those people over there, they're poor because they're stupid, or because they're lazy, or because they're immoral. Those people, have harder lives because they're bad, right? That's real classic kind of racism. And this type of racism is often rooted in the assumption that differences between groups are genetic. That is really an old idea in racism. And in particular, and I'm always all about pointing out how to spot a Nazi online, right? If people start talking about different diets that are better for different groups of people, or relating to race or where you're from or ethnicities or along those lines, those are warning signs of basically of racism, effectively, genetic racism in particular. This type of racism, talked about on this slide, is no longer acceptable in our society, right? At least in public, right? It's not okay to say Black people tend to be poor because they're lazy, right? That's not okay to say anymore. That's really messed up. And good, it's good that that's no longer okay. And when this type of racism does occur, it is often accidental, typically because people do have that implicit bias, and then it comes out in a moment of stress, right? And that's especially a big issue with police and policing, because police are in a situation of high stress all the time, right? So if that implicit bias exists in that person and they make a stressed situation, they make a very serious decision in a stress situation and they decide wrong, that can lead to some really bad people dying or whatever. Yeah, so here's a more complex definition of racism. And like I said, when people have conversation over whether something is racist versus when something isn't racist, and there's a real fight there, it's because people are disagreeing about the definition of racism often. So you can also view racism as a system of oppression that is embedded in our society. This is what we call the racism as structure definition, right? So in this idea, this set of concepts, and this is incredibly complex. I'm really distilling it into one slide. Racism happens when people are oppressed. That's what racism is, right? So when people are unable to do the things that people in the dominant group do, then that is racism, right? Thus, from this definition, white people cannot be subject to racism because white people are the majority, and they/we, because I am a white person speaking, control the major structures of our society, right? There are way, way, way more white politicians in power, way, way, way more white people who own mega corporations, right, than there are people of other racial groups. That is what we're talking about there. So a white person can't get discriminated against in the same way that people of other groups can. And this is often a concept that unfortunately very well-intending academics who are so deeply steeped in the academia of race theory forget everyone doesn't know. So there can be a speaker saying things, yeah, anyway. Does this make sense? This is a really important big concept. Are there any questions here?
Yeah,
No?
me. Is it racist to not condemn racism?
I mean, certainly by that first definition, right? Certainly by that, well, the only way to be racist is to actually actively discriminate. That is, it's not, right? But if you look at that racism as structure element of it, it gets a little murkier, right? I would say that the short and this isn't a morality class, but it certainly may not be ethical to not condemn that, right? And if it were a situation where if a white person didn't condemn racism, and in that not condemning racism, they got a job, or they maintained their social status in a given group that was indeed racist, then that absolutely would be racist. Does that help, Ben?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
More or less. More or less. That's a big idea, though, and that certainly is within the realm of this more complex definition, right? It's a hard question that we white people have to deal with. Yeah, certainly. Absolutely. Is it sexist for a male to not actively condone sexism? Is it homophobic for a straight person to not condemn homophobia? I know that people definitely make the argument that it is the duty of those who do privilege from these identities, say the ones I have of being a straight white male. There's actually some pretty good research to show that people who are prejudiced tend to listen to people who are of the dominant group more often than they will listen to people who are of the minority group. So if you are a white person, it does absolutely help to also condone racism. Good questions. Good. Okay, neat. Good stuff. and into genocide. There's no good way to transition into talking about genocide. Genocide is the deliberate and systematic extermination of racial, ethnic, national, or cultural groups. We have to talk about this stuff because there are groups in our society who are gaining or just coming out of the woodwork. You know, the alt-right is real in our society. There are people that ally themselves with the Nazi party that are present in our societies. So we do have to talk about this stuff, and it is real. So genocide is the society actively trying to kill out an entire group of people. I'm not going to test you on all of these, but here we have the 10 stages of genocide, and this actually was done by the University of, I can't see my citation there because, again, my projector isn't great, but genocide is a real thing. Population transfer, then, is one of the major precursors of genocide itself. Population transfer is a major concern to the international community. A lot of these steps can happen in a society without genocide actually occurring. But when you see the forcible removal of a group of people from a territory they've traditionally occupied to move them to another territory, it is a very short step to actual genocide there. So the international community absolutely does look at that sort of thing. If we put elements into context, I can tell you the international community is absolutely looking at our current approaches to immigration, and it is kind of ringing warning bells because of any time you see groups of people extracted from places and being put other places, it is of deep concern. The Holocaust is certainly the worst act of genocide to have ever occurred in human history. And I'm sure you've probably learned something about the Holocaust. My job here is to make sure that you know the full, not even the full scope, just enough to be a citizen, really. The Holocaust was the murder of millions of Jews and other enemies of Nazi Germany from the years 1941 to 1945. During that period, 6 million Jews were murdered, right? And to put that into context, in 2020 today, there are only 15 million Jews, right? That killed globally almost half the population of that group. And had the Nazis not been defeated, it probably would have been much, much worse. Additionally, during the Holocaust, 3 million other people were also killed and systematically targeted. So the Gypsies, the Roma, that's the same group of people, communists and socialists, homosexuals, disabled people, and also German resistance fighters. There were a lot of people in Germany that didn't like Hitler, that were fighting against them, and we will probably never know exactly how many German resistance fighters there were because they were absolutely stamped out. Certainly, though, the largest overwhelming number of people killed in the Holocaust were Jewish people. Additionally, and I ran into this afternoon as I was doing my background of this and looking up the exact numbers, there are some scholars who are now arguing that as many as 11 million to 20 million people were killed by the Nazis during the Holocaust. And that doesn't include soldier casualties. That just counts the Nazi party, the German state of that era, straight up just murdering people, which these numbers are so big that it's really hard to comprehend. And if I fully took a moment to comprehend that now, I'm not sure we could really keep talking about this very important subject. Let it sink, let that stuff sink in sometime. It really, really horrible. So the Holocaust was the largest genocide. That's not great wording. It's the largest genocide to have ever occurred in human history. Why was it the largest genocide? Well, one portion of it was technology. In the 1940s, when the Holocaust occurred, that was the very infancy and beginning of the information revolution, and after most of the Industrial Revolution had occurred. As a result of that, these lines we see here of the routes that people being shipped to the concentration camps, these are, for the most part, the major railway lines that go through Germany, that go through Europe, right? So most of these were railway lines. And that railway infrastructure was what enabled Nazi Germany to ship people from one place to another quickly and efficiently. Additionally, this is one of the very first adding machines and computers produced by IBM, the same IBM that still makes computers today. IBM produced this technology for the Nazis, produced the punch cards that the Nazis used to systematically round up people, right? So one of the major reasons why the Nazis were as successful, in a negative way certainly, as they were in executing all those people, is that technology was on their side for the first time. And let that be a warning to us today, right? Technology has not gone away since the 1940s. If a full-scale genocide were to break out in the modern day in an industrialized, fully with it society like Nazi Germany was, it would be beyond the scope of being able to fully comprehend. Now, there were genocides prior to the Holocaust. That's not to say that there weren't, right? But those genocides did not have the benefit of technology the way the Nazis did. And also take note of the time periods, right? The Nazis did all that stuff in 4 years, just under 4 years, actually. The Mongol conquest of Western, I don't speak Chinese or Mandarin, Xia or Xia, I'm not sure, of Western Xia, which is in modern China. The Mongols killed 1.5 million people. During the Armenian, I meant to put these in chronological order, sorry about that. The Armenian genocide in Turkey, which occurred between 1915 and 1922, that was 1,800,000 dead. The Queensland Aboriginal genocide, which occurred in Australia from 1840 to 1897. Genocides can take a long time too. They can occur over a long period of time. I can't see that number, is in the tens of thousands. And then the Indian removal that occurred in the United States from 1830 to 1847, right? Again, a 17-year period. There were 8,000 people dead in that situation. And the broader scope of the extermination of American Indians in American history, really, you can make very good arguments that period of time does classify as being a genocide. One of the reasons why it doesn't quite classify as being a genocide is because of the lack of centrality of focus, right? Andrew Jackson came really, really close. And this Indian removal, this was during the Jackson administration. It was the closest we came to actually centralized genocide of the Native Americans. But the Indian Wars in the second part of the 1800s absolutely also really, really bad. If you ever want to really learn a lot about this stuff and read about the Bureau of Indian Affairs, read about these private schools that were called the Indian schools, read up on it. I mean, it is hard information to have to deal with, but like we also did really bad things to people in our society. Now, there have been genocides that have occurred after the Holocaust. Since the Holocaust, the international community has become more sensitive to the risk of genocide, right? We monitor when population transfer is occurring, right? And the reason why the international community monitors that is because it's a warning that there might be a genocide soon. However, because of that, there is a political barrier to labeling on the international scale, not national politics, but international politics, in labeling instances as actually genocide. And that reluctance to call something genocide leads to this strange term of ethnic cleansing, which is basically, a loose definition of it is smaller scale genocide, which it's still genocide. The Cambodian genocide, which occurred in Cambodia from 1975 to 1979. The Rwandan genocide, within many of our lifetimes, occurred in 1994. There is an okay movie called Hotel Rwanda that came out in the early 2000s. It gives an okay, it's not the best movie, but it gives a feel for it. The Bosnian genocide, which occurred in the country of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The country is actually named Bosnia and Herzegovina. That's one country. It better, though, in this conflict is understood as the former Yugoslavia. This occurred between 1992 and 1995. I believe, I can't see that number. But the Bosnian genocide was the genocide where the term ethnic cleansing comes from. You'll note that it occurred in the mid-90s. Sociologically, American society and many other societies really didn't know how to deal with race and ethnicity during that era. And I really equate that term ethnic cleansing with a inability to not label something as genocide on the international level, almost out of niceties. It's really messed up thing, honestly. But yeah, that occurred then too, and by these standards, it was a genocide. And there is our spot on class. We are going to take let's take a little bit of a break here. Let's get back at our computers at 7:30. I'll get that started. Do whatever you have to do for the next couple of minutes. I'll be right back. 7:29. You can hear this and you're not at your computer. Maybe get back to your computer. Gonna start up in a minute. Or maybe I lied and it's 7:30 right now. So time to be back.
Hey, Jeremy,
Yeah,
can I ask you a question about something you talked about earlier?
sure.
So if race isn't like based on biology, what is the 23andMe and like Ancestry DNA kits doing?
Yeah, so that's pretty wild. So you can link certain genes to being present in certain populations, but that's just a small physical component. And basically what those do is they connect traits to, let's say, for example, let's talk about something a lot of people know. Lactose intolerance lactose tolerance is largely a European trait because our foodways include a lot of milk and that sort of thing. There's also lactose tolerance in a good portion of Africa. But if you could trace those portions of the ability to process milk and then combine that with other stuff, then you can link them back to regions, but that just means that your ancestors were in that region of the world. It doesn't necessarily mean, for example, that they were white, right? Because there were African people that lived in those areas too. Does that make sense? Yeah, if I were a geneticist, I would answer that a heck of a lot more eloquently, but that's the general idea. All they know, and it's something, is that those genetic traits were present in those areas, is the thing. Yeah, that's a good question. Anything else?
I was just wondering what the difference is between like a movement and an organization. Because I know like some people consider Black Lives Matter like an organization, and they argue that's why it's like political and it's not okay for teachers to wear a shirt that says Black Lives Matter in school.
Yeah, actually Black Lives Matter is specifically not an organization. There was a court ruling stating that, and I hate to be this way, but those people are wrong, claiming that it is specifically an organization. There was a court ruling that said that, and the court ruling basically said, well, I guess it's a hashtag, but a hashtag is not an organization. Now, specifically though, there are Black Lives Matters organizations, right? I don't know if this group actually exists, but like there could be a group called Black Lives Matters of Columbus, and that's an organization, right? Because to be an organization, you have to have a leader, you have to have structure. Black Lives Matter doesn't have those things, so it's not an organization. Yeah. Good question. And that's a present question in our society. Cool.
Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, great. Those are good questions. Let's talk about class though. I say as for some reason I'm having some sort of really cool allergic reaction to my eyes. Not the pepper allergy thing I had last week, but something else entirely. So, class. Like race, class is a complex series of concepts and conflicting definitions. So there are multiple definitions of class as well. Marx's definition was that understanding class is all about understanding wealth and to a degree income. So when Marx talks about social class in his writings, he's talking about people's access to money and things that can make money, right? Now, Weber says, okay, Marx, and if you're not really educated in sociology, which I don't expect you to be, Weber spent most of his career really kind of debating with Marx 40 years after Marx died, right? Weber came significantly after Marx. And he added onto Marx's observations by saying, yes, it is absolutely wealth. That's part of it. But there's also power and there's also prestige. So you can have boatloads of money, but if no one listens to you and everyone thinks you're a total slime ball, then you have nothing, right? A real good example of this is, if you know who Larry Flint is, he's the founder of Hustler magazine, right? Known pornographer, known, very, very sociologically interesting guy, but total slime ball, right? He's an example with loads of wealth, some power, but very little prestige. And to understand people's setting in society, you have to understand these three combined. With that said, what Marx is talking about, and in just understanding wealth and just understanding the material stuff people have, that goes a really long way. But to really understand all of stuff relating to class, you have to understand these factors as well. Yeah. Anyway, wealth is the value of everything a person owns. This is especially the things that we own, the property that earns money, right? That's what Marx calls productive property. Marx, his big distinction between the rich and the poor, the bourgeoisie, the owning class, and the proletariat and the working class was this access to productive property. This wealth is built up over a lifetime and can potentially be passed down over generations to create new opportunities, and I should also put new privilege, right? And it should be noted that in the United States, the upper classes own a disproportionate amount of wealth compared to the lower classes, right? Most of the wealth in our society is owned by the extremely rich, the extremely wealthy, if you will. Common examples of wealth include stocks, bonds. It can also include real estate. And it used to be that a common form of wealth was home ownership, and that is really still the most common type of wealth still in our society. But the types of wealth that the super rich own are things like factories, things like McDonald's is, or farmland, or things like that. And in that way, those types of productive property really common people don't really own. So Marx's observations do line up that way. So income, though, is different than wealth. Income is the amount of money a person or household earns in a given period of time. This can and does include job salary. It can include money you make on investments. It can include Social Security, so the money you get from pulling your Social Security, or disability benefits if that applies to you. If you're not rich, most of the money that you have probably classifies as income, right? Most people in our society, the money that they have is largely temporary. That's what most of us are dealing with. Most of us spend most of our income on food, clothing, shelter, healthcare, and other costs of daily living. So something like childcare is a major cost. I can't. Oh boy, I have saved. I will talk about money. I have saved about $1,200 a month every single month since COVID broke out by not having to pay for childcare. I wish I could put my kid in childcare, right? Because it would help me work a lot easier, but kind of the consolation prize is that I don't have to pay that, but it also makes my job much harder. and I could be, you know, not teaching class right now and watching The Simpsons or something, you know, those sorts of things. Anyway, median US income is decreasing, right? So the income for most of us in this country is going down. In the 2000 census, and this is accounting for inflation, in the 2000 census, the median income, the middle income was just over $63,000 per year. In the 2010 census, it was $55,000 a year. So, and of course, rounding, that is an $8,000 decrease or a decline of more than 12%. I am apprehensive to see what the 2020 census numbers look like. Of course, given the events of this year, we can I don't know, we'll see if the 2020 census is scientifically useful, but I would expect that we're going to see additional decline in this, just based on the information that I've seen. Anyway, here's a major issue with conversations about class in the United States. Most Americans think they're middle class, and most Americans aren't middle class. It's simply not true that most Americans are middle class. 30% of Americans are actually middle class, only 30% of us. Some people are rich, some people are poor, right? And we don't like to talk about poverty, and poor people don't talk about often being poor, and you certainly wouldn't feel comfortable talking about your friend being poor, even if they are poor, right? We shrug away from those things. Just like race and religion, we have folkways that discourage us from talking about money, right? So this is one of our coping mechanisms society. By not talking about money, we say, oh, we're middle class. We're all middle class. And sometimes even politicians and even presidential candidates claim to be middle class. That was part of a conversation in the 2000 election cycle when Gore and Bush were debating. Bush claimed that he was a middle class guy, which is total horseshit. He's rich. He's very rich, right? It's just really kind of unbelievable. One second. Okay. A lot of our concepts of everyone being middle class is tied into our social constructions around this thing called the American dream. At one time, the American dream was live and well. We can still make arguments that it's adjusted or whatever, but this was the pervasive ideology present in the United States during the 20th century, was this concept of the American dream. However, there are major flaws in that idea. The idea that anyone in America can prosper if they work hard, right? Well, first of all, who is anyone, right? Are women? Are we talking about women? Certainly in the 50s and 60s we weren't, and really into the 70s and 80s we weren't. Are we talking about Black people? Because Black people were segregated and kept from doing many jobs, and that's not to speak of the jobs that Latinx and Asian people and all kinds of other groups of people were kept from being able to do during this era. Are we talking about LGBT people? Right? And what does prosper include? Does prosper include the ability to have your spouse and a couple kids? Well, that was absolutely denied of LGBT people until 2012 and is still being denied of some LGBT people. It's something troubling to deal with, because the American dream means and meant so much to so many people that there was a time that even questioning this would get students incredibly upset. And now we're at a point where we almost have accepted that it was a fallacy. And I don't feel great saying that the American dream doesn't exist anymore, but I'm not sure. Well, but a lot of that concept of the American dream was tied in with the prosperity of the United States after World War II. We were an absolute economic powerhouse following World War II because I think I said this last week. I'm not sure which class I said this in. We basically destroyed, and we didn't do it all on our own, but the infrastructure of Europe was decimated. The infrastructure of China was decimated. The infrastructure of Japan was decimated, right? There were no competitors for the United States in the late 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, right? So it took a long time for everyone else to catch up. And Japan, who is a major producer of technology today, didn't really catch up until the 80s and 90s, right? They didn't become what they are today until the 80s and 90s. So this concept that anyone can prosper if they work hard is also largely based on the economy present in the United States after the Second World War, which, again, it's really not something we can rely on anymore. This prosperity itself created the baby boom, right? So it was a really good time to be white in America during that era. It was a great time for prosperity. Maybe it made sense to have 3 kids during that era. And add into that you could have this prosperous life with just one person in the household working as well, right? My grandfather was more financially stable than being the only earner in the household with 3 kids than I am today being one of 2 earners with 2 kids, right? And that isn't because my grandfather was a super smart guy, but that's not because he was so much better of a worker than I am, right? It was because structurally we were in a better place. Now, how did it all fall apart? Since the 1970s, manufacturing jobs have been replaced by service sector work. But the lower pay scales, fewer benefits, and they're less likely to be unionized. So typically, manufacturing jobs, which were one of the cornerstones of the American economy, they typically were union jobs with higher pay and better benefits. In the time when we were a manufacturing economy, in that era was really the heyday of unions in this country. And during that period, when unions were super powerful, the bosses also learned how to prevent unions and how to bust unions and break unions. So when the time came for jobs to start going overseas and for our economy to start transitioning from a factory-based economy to a service, a restaurant-based economy, those industries that started growing after manufacturing knew and learned how to prevent unions from happening, right? So it's not that workers don't want unions, it's that bosses are really good at keeping unions from happening. Additionally, and I just like to make these points, just because your parents or your grandparents had better jobs than you when you were their age does not mean that you're lazy. It's that, quite frankly, our modern economy has fewer opportunities for younger people. It's a lot harder now to be a young person than it used to be. It's a lot harder to be a lot of people. Yeah. So here we have a basic breakdown of typical household incomes tied with occupations and this class structure. I'm not going to talk through all of this, but oftentimes people ask the question, well, what percentage of the population are these groups? Most notably, that top 1% being in the capitalist class, and they make more than $25,000, $250,000 a year per year, but most of their income is kind of insignificant compared to their actual wealth. There are other things on here. I'm going to talk about each of these positions in the class hierarchy in the following slides. So, the upper class. These are the wealthiest people in the class system. They make up about 1% of the total US population, and they possess, as I mentioned, most of the wealth in the country. These are the super wealthy people. And this 1% of the super wealthy, they tend to hide, they tend to live away from public life. So there really aren't so many examples of them except for super famous people, right? So these are our examples we have. Note the appearance of Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates, big tech guys, right? This is their physical appearance. Zuckerberg's wearing a sweater with his sleeves pulled up slightly. Bill Gates, they're pretty modest looking guys, right? They literally don't look like $1 million. They look modest. Well, I guarantee you that's an element of being in the upper class, at least in the United States. Different societies do being super rich differently. If you're super rich in the UK, you may be a little bit more likely to be a little bit more extravagant. But I guarantee you that this sweater he's wearing, his sweater compared to my sweater, right? It fits him really well, right? That's because it's tailored, right? This is probably a $10,000 sweater, right? Probably. It was probably custom made for him. This is probably some sort of custom wicking fabric. And same goes for Bill Gates, right? This shirt that he's wearing underneath his other shirt probably costs more than I make in a month, right? And his glasses, and it's not just the frames, but the lenses and everything. Like, they play it down, the top 1%. Additionally, they separate themselves from the rest of society. Chances are you don't know any upper class people. I mean, you might know a couple, given that you're going to a relatively expensive liberal arts school. There might be a few upper class people that you know, but if you do know them, you don't necessarily know exactly how much money and power they have. We'll kind of talk about rich people you know in the next slide. Upper middle class people, these are the rich people you know. These are people like my Aunt Debbie, right, who owns multiple radiology clinics, right? These are people who are small business owners, prosperous small business owners, right? Not all small business owners. These are professionals. These are directors of corporations. These are managers. The upper middle class makes up about 14% of the total US population. The upper middle class are culturally distinct for their tendency toward conspicuous consumption, which is upper middle classes people tendency to spend money to show that they have money. They tend to have very big houses. They tend in very obvious pieces of real estate that everyone can see their house, right? That's a big distinction between the upper middle class and the top 1%, is that the top 1% like to have properties that are kind of hidden from everyone else, while the upper middle class like to have a huge house up on a hill that everyone can see, right? They do things like taking 2 or more long vacations a year. We really see examples of upper middle class culture in commercials. One thing that really is obvious when I see TV are car commercials, right? Nobody I know has ever given a brand new car to their spouse for Christmas, right? But we always see these commercials of people giving cars to people at Christmas. That is very much a upper middle class. It would be doable for an upper middle class person. It wouldn't even make financial sense for them. But that's that kind of idea that you could do something like that. It's very much, and we note this really pretty big house in the background, both in a northern climate and a more southern climate. Our aspirational commercials absolutely are, first of all, geared toward the upper middle class, but they also work on middle class and sometimes working class people too, because we aspire to be upper middle class. Right? We want to be those people that are comfortable. Interestingly, surveys have found that the amount of money people claim would be an amount of money that you wouldn't have to worry about money anymore. That amount of money is an individual salary of $80,000 per year. Is what people often talk about as being the amount of money you don't have to worry about money anymore. That is a individual salary of an upper middle class person. So there's something to that there. It's what feels like prosperity to us without actually being that hyper elite country club yacht driving people. The middle class then, that everyone seems to think that they're a part of, the middle class consists primarily of what are called white-collar workers. White-collar workers are typically office workers. They typically work in processing information of one kind or another. There are a lot of IT people that are middle-class white-collar workers. There are a lot of people who do sales, right, who sell real estate possibly, or work for a business who sells something. Office work is really what typifies upper middle class people. I'm sorry. Home ownership was once an indicator of middle class status, but home ownership is becoming less common. That speaks to a lot of things in our society. So what are the working class then? If people don't say that they're middle class, the second most likely they're willing to say is that they're working class. People do take pride in being working class. So what exactly does that mean? These in the past have been blue collar workers. So people like steel workers or miners or people who worked in manufacturing. My examples always relate to steel because I grew up outside Pittsburgh. That's just the first thing I think of. If I grew up outside Detroit, I would say auto workers. Working class people are less likely to have a college degree. As I mentioned, since the 1970s, working class people tend today, by the standards, to be less distinctively like this and more distinctively like restaurant kind of people, right? So people who work in a kitchen or people who are, waiters at nice restaurants. These are the working class people of today in providing services in the service industry. Lower class people then, these are poor people, right? That doesn't mean that they're bad people. The classification of poor people, that is a thing. There have been movements to take back that word poor, but it hasn't really taken off like some other things, but it is absolutely a thing. Typically, poor people have lower levels of education and literacy than other classes. Now, this is important to understand because it does not mean that poor people are stupid. It doesn't mean that they're less intelligent. What it means is twofold. They didn't have the opportunity to get an education because maybe they couldn't afford it. Or even if maybe they could afford it through scholarships or whatever, their parents and nobody they knew to apply to schools because no one in the family ever attended a really expensive school or even college in any way, right? So that's an element of that there. Additionally, and you think about this, often lower class people, poor people work multiple part-time jobs. So imagine you work from 8 to noon at Walmart, and then from 12:30 to 5 you work at Taco Bell, and then on your way home you might work a couple hours as either an Uber or a Lyft driver, right? After working a 14-hour day at 3 jobs, you're exhausted, right? You just want to go home, you want to watch a little bit of Netflix, and you don't really want to sink into Moby Dick, right? You're tired. It doesn't mean you're stupid because you don't read those huge books. It's like you're tired, and God forbid you have kids, you absolutely aren't getting any reading done. So it's a super common misconception that poor people are dumb, and it absolutely isn't the case. It's that kind of mindset that really makes me very angry. And then the underclass. There are people who are very poor in our society, and many underclass people are at least partially dependent on public assistance or food pantries. Often they have limited transportation. So if you don't have a car in many of our cities, including Columbus, you can't get anywhere, right? Well, if you can't get anywhere, your job possibilities are limited. Your nutrition possibilities are limited. This is what's called a food desert, right? There are areas in typically urban areas, but they can also exist in rural areas where your food and your eating possibilities are intensely limited because there is no subway, that you don't have a car, so you can't get stuff. And so there are many areas in most major cities, Columbus absolutely included, where you're stuck eating at corner stores. And corner stores oftentimes have food that's about as good as a gas station. And think about how healthy you would be. Think about how good you would feel about your body if you only ever ate gas station food, right? Like it's rough, it's real rough. Oftentimes underclass people don't possess official state IDs, and that can get in the way of voting, right? Voter ID laws absolutely get in the way of people who are very poor. And sometimes people who are of the underclass engage in criminal activity in order to try to make ends meet. If you want to learn more about that, that is what Robert Merton called in his strain theory of deviance, what he calls innovator behavior. Where people try to innovate they try to make money through non-conventional means, and those non-conventional means are breaking the law. And that is a behavior that people do when they have no other choice to provide for themselves or their families. It's a very useful, in terms of criminology, a very useful set of theory for understanding behavior of people who break the law, and understandable. Let's talk about some concepts related to socioeconomic class. Social reproduction is one of these concepts. So social reproduction is the tendency for social class status to be passed down from one generation to the next. Chances are you are of a similar class status to your parents, and also to a similar class status as your grandparents, probably. According to Pierre Bourdieu, who is really one of, this concept of social reproduction is his concept. He was an amazing social thinker, philosopher, also sociologist. This occurs because each generation acquires cultural capital. So cultural capital are the tastes, the habits, the expectations, the skills, which help us to gain advantages in society. So we teach our kids cultural capital, and your parents taught you cultural capital, whether they were doing it on purpose or not, right? You do things with your kids. First of all, first, who knows which is first or second, because it's tolerable to you, because you want to do it, right? So you take them, maybe enroll them in ballet class, because when you were young, maybe you were involved in ballet and you think it's a good thing, right? Or maybe you watch football with them on Saturdays and you think that is something that's good. And again, whether you're doing it on purpose or not, we give these skills to our children. This cultural capital then either helps or hinders us as becoming adults, and it has a tendency to help in reproducing our class status. Let me give you an example there. Let's say you're applying for a job at Lowe's, right? And you grew up in a middle class or working class background, and every Saturday afternoon you watch the OSU game with your dad, right, growing up. And then going into it, let's say, and you got a proclivity for watching football. Well, then when that guy that's hiring you at Lowe's says, how about them Buckeyes? You can say, yeah, how about them Buckeyes? They scored a bunch of football points, hooray, right? You wouldn't say it like that because that's clumsy, right? But you would say it in a more eloquent way. But if you were going to a interview, say to get a $1 million endowment for, let's say you work for Otterbein and you're trying to get some endowment money, right? And how about them Buckeyes probably wouldn't have the same cultural cachet as being able to relate to the conversation, the time if you were a rich person that you studied abroad in France and how valuable that was to you, and your summering in France was so helpful, right? So that's why we need to fund the French program at Otterbein, right? That is an example of cultural capital that would work in that situation better than just how about them Buckeyes. Does that make sense? Does that concept make sense? And you can really see, this is a concept that allows you to socially engineer your life, right? Because if you are class conscious, right? If you're aware of the class setting you're trying to work yourself in, then you can know maybe what kind of small talk to make during a job interview or in interviews for grad school or whatever, right? Those sorts of things. And it can help you. It absolutely can. Social mobility then. Social mobility is the movement of individuals or groups within the hierarchical system of social classes. So we live in a class-based society. Within a closed system, there is very little opportunity to move from this should say category, from one category to another, and this should say the caste system is an example of a class system. Sorry about that typo. Oh, actually these labels here are backwards. I'm sorry about that. In an open system, it's one with a lot of opportunities to move from one category to another. And an open system is the class system. The closed system is the caste system. Now, in modern American society, you can easily make an argument that we're somewhere between an open system and a closed system. There still is a possibility to move up in the world. That is a possibility. There isn't somebody intentionally keeping you from doing that, but it is a lot harder than it used to be 30, 40 years ago, maybe even 20 or 15 years ago. That's what these concepts are. So we have a lot of vocab coming up in the following slides. So intergenerational mobility. This is the movement between social classes that occurs from one generation to the next. An example of intergenerational mobility, if you know your Latin root words, inter means between, right? Between two things. Intergenerational mobility, your parents move to a place, either they immigrate or they move to a different city or whatever, to help give you a better life. That's an example of intergenerational mobility. Or maybe your parents help pay for your college. That's an example out of the resources that they acquired over their lifetime, and they're trying to give you a boost. That's intergenerational mobility. Intragenerational mobility is the movement between social classes, intra meaning within one thing, that occurs over the course of one individual's lifetime. So let's say you save your money for a few years after high school so that you can attend college on your own because your parents can't help you financially. That's intra-generational mobility. Or maybe you perform very well at a job and you get a really good promotion. That's also intra-generational mobility, where you take yourself up to the next level of class. In terms of inter and intra, intergenerational mobility tends to be more common than intragenerational mobility. That's one set of concepts. Another set is horizontal social mobility versus vertical social mobility. So horizontal social mobility is the occupational movement of individuals or groups within a social class. So we're talking about changing from one job to another job, about the same pay, about the same status, maybe just this workplace works better than your other workplace. That's horizontal social mobility. So maybe you quit your McDonald's job to go work at Taco Bell, right? They're both about the same status. It's McDonald's versus Taco Bell. It's about the same stuff, right? That's horizontal social mobility. Vertical social mobility is the movement between social classes and is often called, depending on the direction, either upward mobility or downward mobility. You could also call it either positive or negative. That's what I call it right here. So positive vertical mobility is a job that has better pay and better status. So let's say you went from working at McDonald's to working at IKEA, right? It's not a huge jump, but it's a positive jump. Or maybe negative vertical mobility has worse pay and worse status. You go from working at McDonald's to being a professional porta-john cleaner, right? It's a lesser status. It might actually, it probably does pay better, but it's a lesser status. People aren't really excited to talk about that job that you do. They might be willing to think about talking about McDonald's, right? That's a downward social mobility. Or you could lose your job and not have a job. That also is the same thing. Okay, this slide is blank for no reason. In the United States, let's talk about the federal poverty line. The federal poverty line is an absolute measure of annual income and is frequently used to determine who should be categorized as poor. In 2009, which again is, we're dependent on the 10-year cycle of the census, 47.8 million people, or just under 16% of the population in the United States, were considered poor. So that's 15% were considered poor according to federal guidelines. Now, these guidelines are pretty high in terms of who is actually considered poor and survivability. Basically, if you're making the most a poor person can make based on these guidelines, you're still hurting pretty bad. Yeah. So let's go back to talking about mobility. Structural mobility refers to changes in the social status of large numbers of people due to structural changes in society, right? So a lot of people's lives change in either a positive or negative way because of how society has changed. In the 1930s, due to forming unions, thousands of auto workers in Detroit get higher pay, benefits, and better working conditions. As a result, local economies thrive because more people can spend more money. It's not just about the amount of money the worker makes, it's about the amount of money the worker can spend in their community, right? So as a result, in the 1950s, Detroit looked like this, right? And Detroit was able to look like this because a lot of people were making a good amount of money. Detroit doesn't look like this today because people are lazy or they're terrible or they're criminals. That's not why Detroit looks like this. Detroit looks like this today because due to moving manufacturers overseas, thousands of auto workers lost their jobs in Detroit. This kind of economic calamity, it looks like a hurricane hit this street, right? Well, it has the same effect. A social calamity like losing thousands of jobs has the same effect as a hurricane. It's just much, much slower. So people lose their jobs and then they lose their jobs and then suddenly they're unable to go buy a new pair of shoes, go to restaurants, go on vacations, whatever, and spending money. And then also the city isn't able to tax people anymore. And then government workers start losing their jobs. It creates a negative spiral. We saw very similar phenomena in Youngstown, Ohio, when the sheet and tube the steel factories went down in Youngstown. Very, very similar. That's why Youngstown's a wreck. It is actually on the rebound over the last decade or so, but that's why it's a tough place to live. It's because the structure of society shifted in a negative way. Those concepts make sense there. Any questions there before I move on? No? Okay, so let's talk about states of deprivation. Relative deprivation is a relative measure of poverty. So it's a measure of poverty compared to other people, right? People are considered poor if their standard of living is less than that of other members of society, right? If you live in a rich area, you can feel relatively deprived if you are middle class, right? So if you're living in, say, Powell or Dublin here in Central Ohio, and you are either a working class person or a middle class person and you have a very modest house, you can feel poor compared to other people because you're living at a lower standard of living. You might be comfortable, but you're living at a lower basically price point in society than other people. Additionally, if you live in a poor area, you may not feel poor because everyone else is poor, right? This is the main street and the three most photographic images from my hometown, right? These are the three big buildings in my hometown. And I do this alley back here a lot. The backs of these buildings are just like a wreck compared to the front. The front looks presentable, right? These are the three fanciest buildings in the downtown of my hometown. It was a pretty working class and now poor area because of the decline of the steel industry. But I grew up working class, but I felt pretty okay. We were doing pretty good compared to other people because there were a lot of really poor people around us. And it's just, I didn't know any different. I actually, in the 2008 campaign, I did some work for the Obama campaign, and we were going to some areas of Columbus that some people thought were like really poor and sketchy. And like, I was walking around, I was like, this really feels like home, right? It's like, it was really kind of an enlightening thing to me. It's like, wow, I grew up in a rough place. I had no idea. So it's relative deprivation is about basically your position in relation to people in your community. Now, absolute deprivation is an objective measure of poverty that is defined by the inability to meet minimal standards for food, shelter, clothing, or healthcare. Now, before, when I first started teaching about these concepts, I would use, and arguably it was racist, and I'll admit to it. I would use a picture of a little kid in Africa sitting on a chair that had almost no clothing on, right? And that kid, hopefully an adult now, was in a state of absolute deprivation, and that was real. But this is also absolute deprivation, and this exists in Appalachia, pretty close to where we are now if you're in Central Ohio. These buildings are in various conditions of decay, right? And I presume these are buildings that are being used. I presume this building is at least. If these buildings, these are probably storage buildings, if there's little kids running around these buildings, if these are important for day-to-day life, that is absolutely a condition of absolute deprivation, because the structures that they are conducting themselves in are actually dangerous, right? And that's a very real thing. And a lot of kids do go hungry in Appalachia. A lot of kids go hungry in Central Ohio. According to the Mid-Ohio Food Bank, 1 in 5 kids, that's 20% of the population of children, goes hungry on a monthly basis. Not just like not eating good food, but they don't have food at all to eat. So absolute deprivation isn't just something from the third world. Culture of poverty is another phenomenon related to class. This refers to the learned attitudes that can develop among poor communities and lead the poor to accept their fate rather than attempting to improve their situation. So this is something I experienced actually going back to my hometown after enjoying my liberal arts school from over the summer. People would say, so you think you're better than me now? Or time to go back to your fancy college, huh? They'd say in August. Or why can't you find a job back home? My mother would say, well, because I don't want to live like that. I don't want my kids to live in that area. My hometown, I think I've mentioned this before, my hometown, there's a lot of radiation around it, and there's a lot of pollution around it because it was polluted. And those of us who, a lot of people escaped because of those reasons. Now, here's a concept that really ties our two portions of class and race together, this concept of intersectionality. So intersectionality theory claims and posits that each of our lived experiences is shaped by our many identities. Each of us has many identities. We have race identities, we have class identities, gender identities, sexuality identities, religion identities, political identities, all these identities, right? And not only are these identities important to who we are, but these identities interact with each other. They intersect, as in intersectionality. They also impact our experience. It should be noted that this intersectionality theory, that I'll talk about in more detail in the following slides, it originated in feminist theory and women's studies theory. So the original concepts were, what does it mean to be a woman? Is the life of a white woman the same as the life as a black woman? And intersectionality theory would say no. They have a shared bond of being a woman, but the life chances of a black woman and a white woman are different. Additionally, the life chances of a black woman who is heterosexual versus a black woman who is homosexual are different. And the black woman who is homosexual has a different life experience as a white woman is homosexual, as a white man who is homosexual. All of those different identities intersecting with each other make people and make all of us the people who we are. Not only do race and class impact our lives, the interaction between race and class impacts our lives. So these two slides are looking at how race and class interact. Some examples are the Jack and Jill organization. Jack and Jill, and this is a picture from Jack and Jill of Philadelphia, Jill specifically. Jack and Jill is a African-American fraternity of sorts, or I don't know if they classify as a fraternity or a nonprofit organization. Basically, they're an upper class organization for rich Black people. That's what Jack and Jill is. You compare that to the WASPs, the White Anglo-Saxon Protestants of New England. WASPs aren't a specific organization, they're a type of people. It used to be, they're kind of fading away, but they still exist. It used to be that the richest of the elite in the United States were, lived in New England, they were white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And the lived experience of WASPs, and this is a still from a movie called People Like Us, and this guy in particular talking about his experience as being a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant in New England, really pretty reprehensible. When I was watching that documentary, I've watched it many times, I'm never quite sure if this guy's like being tongue-in-cheek or like really sincere. If he's being really sincere in that documentary, I don't know if I said it, it's called People Like Us if you want to watch it. He comes off as a raging asshole, because basically he comes off as like, well, of course we're better than everyone else. Obviously we're better. And this accent like this, that's the waspy fancy accent, right? This guy's lived experience as a rich person is different than these ladies' lived experience, right? Because first of all, even though they're both upper class, right? This guy's white, this guy's a male, they're Black, they're women, they share the same amounts of money, but they have different lived experiences. And then you compare this to poor people who live in Appalachia. This is a picture of a mining, women in a mining community in Appalachia. I think this is a guy right here. These people have absolutely different lived experiences as the people in the upper middle class. Now this girl right here might have some shared experiences with these women, right? And this lady here, but it's different. It's markedly different. So this is another visual for that. So these people being upper middle class, they have the upper class, they have those experiences, and the minors and poor. But also think about the other intersections as well. What if someone who was a WASP in New England was LGBT? Would they be able to enjoy the same privileges as the other people in New England? What if they were a woman versus being a man, right? What if they were very old or very young? What if they were a religious minority, right? And WASPs specifically talk about being Protestant, but what if you're a white Anglo-Saxon Jew in New England, right? And there absolutely is prejudice against Jewish people in many parts of New England. We don't think of New England as being an area that is filled with anti-Semitism, but there are parts that do hold those sorts of prejudices as well. Cool. Well, that is the end of this presentation. There's a lot of content there. Are there any questions on anything? No? Okay, cool. It's about the midpoint in the semester. We can cut out a little bit early. No questions before we end. I was about to use a fancy word, but then I stuck to my roots.
For deprivation, if it's like a chosen lifestyle, it's not still considered deprivation, right? Like a tiny house thing, minimalist.
I mean, I would say that if you make those kinds of choices, you still have access to those privileges, right? You can still, I'm not talking about you, Ben. It's like, but you could, if you were living a minimalist lifestyle, or if even like you were traveling across the country by backpacking, if stuff got real rough, you could still call your mom, right? That is that is different. Or if you knew you could do something else if you really wanted to, just abandon the whole thing. Yeah, and that's another phenomenon entirely. But yeah, I would say that relative deprivation comes in if you would want to do a thing. Yeah, that's a pretty good assessment then, I'd say. Yeah. I think I answered that question.
I was just curious. Thank you.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Yeah, yeah, sure. A lot of times, yeah, I'm not going to keep rambling. Any other questions? All right, cool. I will call this an end for tonight. A reminder, there is no quiz for this week.
Wait, there's a question in the chat.
Oh, there is a question in the chat? Okay. I can't get to that right now. Could someone tell me what it is?
It's a question for clarification on the essay assignment.
Okay, let me go back and let me pull that up. 1 second here, guys. So, stratification. Oh yeah, okay. What, can someone read the question specifically?
Yeah, the question is, it just says, can you explain more about the paper due this week?
Okay, I can do that, sure. And as of course, as soon as you chimed in, I was actually able to find my group chat thing. Okay, so let me read. It's been a while since I've written this. And this is linked on to your page 90 of the Cultural Anthropology Journal if you bought that. When we engage, I'm just reminding myself.
Are we going to need that journal to do the homework assignment?
You don't. This is the exact text, so it's the same thing. So basically, what you want to do is you want to talk about whether you can move up and down in class, what factors affect your ability to move up and down in class, what part does it play in getting an education with class, right? Basically just work yourself down through those bullets of the prompt, right? Reflect on the relationship between race, ethnicity, and class, the ways that class you're born into, and what does that have to do with your ability to move up? So there you want to talk about social reproduction as discussed by Bourdieu. The factors that make it hard to move out of poverty, hard to move out of the upper or middle classes. This is a 500 to 1,000 word essay. You don't have to hit those 1,000 words, but if you want that flexibility of the extra 500 words, I give you that there. Does that all make sense? Yeah, just be sure to hit each of those 5 bullets under the prompt, and you should be pretty good. I'm glad you brought that up though, so I looked at that. Okay. So if there is no further ado, I
have one question.
Sure.
Do you know when the other essays are going to be graded?
So which essays are you talking about? Are you talking about last week's essay?
Last week, the week before, and the week before that. Oh
goodness, you are right. I haven't graded those essays. I'm gonna get those done this week. This is when that's gonna happen. You're right. I haven't graded the economy essay. I haven't graded the society essay. Yeah, I'll get those done this week because you need to have that information going into the midterm. I'll get that done this week. Thanks for reminding me. Anything else? Okay, I'm gonna take my kids screaming upstairs as my cue to be done. And if you need anything else between now and next week, please let me know. It's not gonna be lecture next week. It is going to be study guide stuff next week. So now that I say that, I'm going to try to get your study guide up a little bit earlier than Monday so that you can look over that study guide and be able to work over those questions a little bit. So I'm going to try to get next week's material out a little bit earlier, and then I'll grade that stuff. So I have some work ahead of me. So I will see you all later, and keep wearing those damn masks. They'll help. Bye.